Millionaire finds a small child on the street holding a baby, decides to take them home after discovering they were abandoned. The next day, the police showed up at his house. It was a cold night, one of those that seems to seep into your bones, even inside the comfort of the luxurious car that Richard Marlowe was driving. The city lights, usually bright and vibrant, appeared dimmed, reflecting Richard's somber mood. At 50 years old, he was a man who had reached what many would consider the pinnacle of success: wealth, power, and a grand mansion on the outskirts of the city. But despite all that, Richard couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had accompanied him for years. His life, entirely centered on his businesses, lacked something he couldn't quite define. That night, after an especially long day, he decided to take a different route home. It wasn't something he did often. Richard was a man of strict routines, someone who preferred control over surprises. Yet for some inexplicable reason, he turned right instead of going straight. The road he took led him to a part of the city he rarely visited, a dark and less traveled street where the opulence of his world had no place. The headlights of his car illuminated a scene that made him brake sharply. To the side of the sidewalk, under the dim glow of a street lamp, he saw a small figure huddled up. It was a child, barely visible through the faint light and the cold mist forming in the air. Next to him, wrapped in a worn blanket, was a baby. Richard froze for a moment, his eyes locked on the children, unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a scene he expected to encounter on his way home, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. The child, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, looked up when the car's headlights shone on him. There was something in his expression that made Richard feel a pang in his chest, a mix of fear and hope that seemed to pierce through the emotional armor he had built over the years. The boy said nothing, but his eyes spoke for him, showing a vulnerability Richard hadn't seen in a long time. Richard turned off the engine and hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to getting involved in other people's problems, especially in something so far removed from his world of luxury and comfort. But that night was different. There was something about those children, a fragility and helplessness that resonated deep within him, touching a part of himself he thought had been lost. Finally, making an impulsive decision that went against his nature, Richard got out of the car and approached them. The cold was biting, and the silence of the night almost oppressive. He crouched down in front of the boy, trying not to seem intimidating. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy looked at him but didn't answer. His eyes were filled with an understandable distrust, mixed with a weariness that didn't belong to someone his age. Richard, not knowing what else to say, extended his hand. "You can come with me. You don't have to stay out here in the cold." To his surprise, the boy accepted without resistance. Slowly and cautiously he stood up, holding the baby carefully, and took Richard's hand. The boy's skin was ice cold, and his tattered, dirty clothes offered little protection against the cold. Richard felt a lump in his throat as he led them to his car. He knew he was making a decision that would change something in his life, though he couldn't foresee how much. The drive back to the mansion was silent. The children, exhausted, didn't ask questions, and Richard didn't know what to say. His thoughts kept shifting, trying to understand why he had done what he did, but finding no clear answer. What was he doing? Why had he felt the need to help these children? Those questions tormented him, yet at the same time he felt a strange peace, as if he had done something he instinctively knew was right. When they arrived at the mansion, Richard was greeted by Mrs. Thompson, his housekeeper, an older woman who had worked for him for years and knew his reserved character well. The surprise on her face at seeing the children was evident, but her professionalism kept her from asking questions. She simply led them inside, where she prepared a hot bath and some food. Richard watched in silence, still processing what he had done. There was something about those children that disturbed him, something he couldn't fully comprehend, but that kept him alert and worried. After the children were settled in one of the guest rooms, Richard remained alone in the living room, lost in thought. The house, which had always been a refuge of silence and solitude, felt different that night. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to what he had seen on the street, to the boy's gaze and the weight of the decision he had made. He knew this wasn't something temporary, that by bringing those children into his home, he had taken on a responsibility he couldn't simply ignore. At that moment, for the first time in years, Richard felt that his life was about to change in an irrevocable way. The walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crack, and though he didn't fully understand it yet, he knew that those children had come into his life for a reason that time would reveal. And so, as the mansion slept, Richard remained in the darkness of his living room, contemplating the beginning of what would become the most important journey of his life. Dawn slowly crept into the Marlowe mansion, painting the walls with a soft golden light. Richard, however, hadn't been able to sleep. He had spent the night in the living room, restless, with thoughts swirling that gave him no rest. His life, which until that moment had been so controlled, so predictable, now seemed to be thrown into emotional chaos that he didn't know how to handle. There was something about those children, something that awakened emotions in him that he had buried long ago. As he rose from the sofa and walked upstairs, the silence of the house felt overwhelming. He had decided to bring those children into his home, but he had no idea how to proceed from there. He, a man accustomed to solving complex problems in the business world, found himself lost in the simple task of caring for two small children. As he approached the door of the guest room, he heard a soft murmur, almost a whisper. He carefully opened the door and saw Tommy, the 6-year-old, sitting on the bed next to the baby. Although it was barely dawn, Tommy was already awake, looking at the baby with a tenderness and concern that moved Richard. It seemed that, despite his young age, Tommy had assumed the role of protector, as if he understood that his little brother depended entirely on him. Richard stood in the doorway, watching silently. There was something in the way Tommy cared for the baby that seemed familiar, as if he were seeing a reflection of himself, though in a much younger and more innocent version. He remembered his own childhood, a time he had buried under layers of success and wealth, but that now, seeing Tommy, resurfaced with unexpected intensity. The sound of light footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts. Mrs. Thompson, always punctual and efficient, was approaching down the hallway, carrying a tray with breakfast. Seeing Richard at the door, her expression shifted to a mix of surprise and concern. She knew her boss well enough to realize that this wasn't something he had planned, and that the situation affected him more than he was willing to admit. "Good morning, Mr. Marlowe," she said softly, so as not to wake the baby who had fallen asleep in Tommy's arms. "I've prepared some breakfast for the children. Would you like to come to the dining room?" Richard nodded, still looking at Tommy. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, although I'm not sure if the children are ready to leave the room." Mrs. Thompson smiled kindly. "Don't worry, sir. Children are stronger than they seem. They just need a little time to adjust. If you allow me, I can help Tommy carry the baby to the dining room." Richard stepped back, allowing Mrs. Thompson to enter the room. He watched as, with infinite patience and a natural gentleness, she helped Tommy get up from the bed and guided him toward the dining room, carefully holding the baby. Despite his usual emotional distance, Richard felt a pang of gratitude toward his housekeeper. He knew that without her, he would be completely lost in this situation. Breakfast passed in a strange but not uncomfortable silence. Tommy ate quietly, casting furtive glances at Richard, as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was. Richard, on his part, observed him with a mix of curiosity and confusion. There was something about the boy that intrigued him, something beyond the obvious vulnerability. Tommy was reserved, but his eyes spoke of a life experience that didn't match his age. After breakfast, Richard felt the need to do something, anything, to better understand the children now under his roof. He decided that the best way to start would be to talk to Tommy, try to learn more about his situation. However, when he approached the boy and asked about his family, about how he had ended up on that street the previous night, Tommy immediately shut down. He lowered his gaze, avoiding eye contact, and merely shrugged. Richard didn't press further. He could see that the boy was battling something, a burden he wasn't ready to share. The frustration of not being able to help him gnawed at Richard, but he also understood that he couldn't force the situation. He would have to earn Tommy's trust, and that would require time and patience, two things Richard wasn't accustomed to dealing with in his daily life. Throughout the day, Richard continued to observe Tommy, searching for signs, some clue that might give him an idea of how to act. The boy was surprisingly self-sufficient for his age, something that worried and amazed Richard in equal measure. Instead of playing or seeking attention, Tommy focused solely on caring for the baby. He changed the baby's diapers with a skill that clearly showed it wasn't his first time, and he fed the baby with the bottle Mrs. Thompson had prepared, without showing any signs of impatience or fatigue. That night, after ensuring the children were comfortable and well taken care of, Richard retreated to his study. The house was quiet, but his mind was far from calm. The unanswered questions piled up, and the feeling that there was something more, something he didn't fully understand yet, kept him on edge. He sat at his desk and opened a bottle of whiskey, his usual way of calming down after a difficult day. However, this time, the liquor didn't offer the comfort he expected. He stared at the glass, twirling it between his fingers, and suddenly, the thought of the children sleeping under his roof overwhelmed him with an unexpected force. What would he do with them? What role would they play in his life from now on? He knew he couldn't just let them go, not after what he had seen in their eyes. Finally, after a long night of reflection, Richard made a decision. He didn't know how or why, but he was determined to care for those children. There was something about them that made him feel responsible, something that awakened in him a protective instinct he didn't know he had. It would be difficult, he knew, but he also understood that this was something he had to do, not just for the children, but also for himself. With that resolve, Richard went to bed, knowing that, although the road ahead would be challenging, he was ready to face it. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something meaningful, something that truly mattered. As he drifted into sleep, the image of Tommy caring for the baby came to mind, and he knew this was just the beginning of a profound change in his life. The next morning began with an unusual stillness in the Marlowe mansion. Richard, who had slept little and poorly, woke up with a sense of unease he couldn't fully explain. As he descended the stairs, he was greeted by the aroma of the breakfast Mrs. Thompson had prepared, but the atmosphere in the house felt heavy, laden with an invisible tension. Tommy was sitting at the table, feeding the baby with the same skill he had shown the day before. Richard watched them for a moment from the dining room door, feeling a mix of admiration and concern. He knew he needed to find a way to get to the bottom of the children's story, but he didn't want to pressure Tommy, not until he had earned more of his trust. However, the morning's silence was abruptly interrupted by a loud knock at the front door. Mrs. Thompson, who was serving breakfast, froze, her eyes meeting Richard's, reflecting the same surprise and concern. Richard felt a chill run down his spine as he walked toward the door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with several police officers. Standing in front was a middle-aged man with a stern expression and a posture that radiated authority. Beside him, a young woman with sharp eyes observed him with curiosity. The man stepped forward and spoke in a firm voice. "Mr. Marlowe, I'm Detective John Harris, and this is my partner, Detective Sarah Carter. We're here because of a report received last night about the possible abduction of 2 children. We were informed that a man was seen taking a small child and a baby from a street in the city center. We need to ask you some questions." Richard was momentarily speechless, processing the situation. The word abduction echoed in his mind like a hammer. He was aware that he had made an impulsive decision by bringing those children to his home, but he never imagined anyone would accuse him of something so serious. His first instinct was to be outraged, but he quickly realized that showing anger would only make things worse. "Detective Harris," Richard began, striving to remain calm, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I found those children on the street last night, abandoned and in danger. I just wanted to help them." Sarah Carter, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. "We understand your concern, Mr. Marlowe, but we need to verify the facts. May we see the children?" Richard nodded, his mind working frantically to find the best way to handle the situation. He knew the police weren't there to listen to his version of events. They were there to ensure the children were safe. Mrs. Thompson, who had been watching from a distance, stepped in. "Sir, if I may, I'll take the detectives to the children. They're fine, I assure you. Mr. Marlowe only tried to do the right thing." Harris looked at her with an inscrutable expression before nodding. "Take us to them, please." As Mrs. Thompson led the detectives toward the dining room, Richard followed closely, feeling a mix of nervousness and helplessness. He knew things could quickly turn against him if he didn't manage to prove that he had acted with good intentions. Entering the dining room, he found Tommy and the baby just as he had left them. The baby was in the high chair playing with a spoon, while Tommy watched with a protective expression. Tommy looked up when the detectives entered, and Richard noticed a flicker of fear in his eyes. The boy didn't move, but he visibly tensed as if bracing for the worst. Richard felt a pang of pain in his chest as he realized that despite Tommy's apparent calm, the boy was terrified of what might happen. "This is Tommy and the baby. I'm not sure of his name," Richard explained, feeling Harris's scrutinizing gaze on him. "I found them last night, huddled on the street. I don't know anything more about them, only that they were in a dangerous situation." Sarah approached Tommy, kneeling down to be at his level. "Hello, Tommy," she said softly, trying not to frighten him. "What's your name? And what's your little brother's name?" Tommy looked at Sarah with distrust but didn't answer. He simply pressed his lips together and turned his gaze toward the baby. The gesture was so eloquent that no words were needed. Sarah exchanged a glance with Harris, who nodded slightly. "We understand that you're scared, Tommy," Sarah continued patiently. "We just want to make sure you and your brother are okay. Can you tell us anything about what happened?" Tommy's silence was an answer in itself. Richard felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck. He knew that the boy's silence could be interpreted as a sign that something was wrong. The detectives seemed to think the same, and the tension in the room grew. Finally, Mrs. Thompson broke the silence. "Detective Harris, Detective Carter, I was the one who helped Mr. Marlowe bring these children inside. I can assure you that he only tried to protect them. I saw with my own eyes how they were when he found them. They had no one. They were alone and scared." Harris looked at Mrs. Thompson, evaluating the situation. "We don't doubt what you're saying, Mrs. Thompson," he finally said, though his tone wasn't entirely convincing. "But we need to do our job. The children will need to remain under care while we investigate further." Richard felt a momentary relief, but it was short-lived. He knew this was far from over. The detectives had made it clear that their presence at the mansion wasn't just to ensure the children's safety, but also to uncover if there was something more to the story that Richard wasn't telling. "Could the children stay here while you investigate?" Richard asked, trying to maintain his composure. "I don't want them to go through any more stress." Harris considered this for a moment before responding. "For now, yes, but you must understand this isn't a final resolution. We will continue investigating." Sarah stood up and looked at Richard with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mr. Marlowe, this is an unusual case. We appreciate your cooperation, but there are still many unanswered questions. We'll be in touch." Richard nodded, knowing that his life, already disrupted by the arrival of the children, was about to become even more complicated. The police weren't going to let this go, and every move he made would be watched and scrutinized. As the detectives left, Richard stood at the door watching as the police cars drove down the long driveway. He felt a knot in his stomach. He had done what he believed was right, but now he was trapped in a situation that could spiral out of control at any moment. Returning inside, he found Tommy sitting in the same spot, watching the baby. Richard approached and sat down beside him, feeling an urgent need to connect with the boy, to make him understand that he was there to help. "I won't let them hurt you," he said quietly, more to himself than to Tommy. "We'll find a way through this, I promise." Tommy didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Richard knew in that moment that the promise he had just made wasn't only for Tommy, but also for himself. And somehow, he would have to find a way to keep it, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The following days at the Marlowe mansion were marked by a heavy and uncertain atmosphere. Richard tried to maintain a facade of calm, but inside his mind was in constant turmoil. The almost daily presence of Detectives Harris and Sarah Carter only heightened his anxiety. He knew his life was under constant scrutiny, and every question they asked, every detail they investigated, brought them closer to a truth he would rather keep hidden. Tommy, for his part, remained as reserved as ever. Although Richard tried to get closer to the boy, his efforts seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier. Tommy didn't say much, but he observed everything around him with keen eyes, as if constantly evaluating his surroundings and the people around him. Richard was beginning to realize that, despite his young age, Tommy had experienced things that had forced him to grow up faster than normal. One afternoon, while Richard was working in his study, Sarah knocked on the door. He had seen her several times over the past few days, but this time he noticed something different in her expression. There was a mix of determination and compassion that put him on alert. "Mr. Marlowe, may we talk?" Sarah asked, entering the study with a folder under her arm. Richard nodded and leaned forward, preparing for whatever she was about to reveal. Sarah sat down in front of him, and after a brief silence, she opened the folder and pulled out some documents. "We've been investigating the children's past, but we've also reviewed your history, Mr. Marlowe," Sarah began, her voice firm but not accusatory. "And we've found something I believe you need to know." Richard felt a knot in his stomach. He knew this moment would come sooner or later, but he wasn't prepared to face it. "What did you find?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Years ago, you were involved in a fierce business competition with a man named Victor Hargrove," Sarah continued, wasting no time. "We know that competition ended disastrously for him. Hargrove lost everything: his company, his fortune, and his family. He disappeared off the radar after that, and we've discovered that he spent some time abroad before secretly returning to the country." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, letting the name resonate in his mind. Hargrove. It was a name he hadn't spoken in years, but one that had left an indelible mark on his life. The competition with Hargrove had been brutal. Richard had used every trick in the book to destroy his rival and secure his own success. At the time, he hadn't stopped to think about the personal consequences for Hargrove, but now, all of it was coming back to him with unsettling clarity. "Are you suggesting these children are connected to Hargrove?" Richard asked, opening his eyes and fixing them on Sarah. "We can't say for certain, but there are too many coincidences to ignore," Sarah replied. "Hargrove didn't disappear completely, Mr. Marlowe. He reinvented himself under a false name, and according to our investigations, he's been watching your movements for years, waiting for the right moment to—" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. Richard looked at her intently, understanding what she was implying. "To get revenge," he finished. Sarah nodded slowly. "It's a possibility we can't rule out. The children could be part of that plan." The impact of those words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. He stood up from his chair and began pacing the study, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just discovered. Hargrove, a man he had mercilessly destroyed, had returned to make him pay the price. And now those children, whom Richard had begun to see as his responsibility, were caught in the middle of a revenge scheme that should never have happened. "What are you going to do about it?" he finally asked, stopping to look at Sarah. "We're delving deeper into Hargrove's life, trying to track every move he's made since he returned to the country," she replied. "But the most troubling thing is that Hargrove seems to have vanished again, just as we were closing in on the truth. This leads us to believe that he's on the move and his next target could be you." Richard felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. He couldn't allow Hargrove to harm those children or anyone else. He had spent too long ignoring the consequences of his actions, but now reality had caught up with him in the most brutal way possible. "Tommy knows something," Richard said, more to himself than to Sarah. "I see it in his eyes. He's keeping a secret, and I think it has to do with Hargrove." Sarah nodded, but her expression grew serious. "That's likely, but we can't push him too hard. The boy has already been through so much. We need his trust to get to the truth, not his fear." Richard knew she was right, but he also knew that time wasn't on their side. If Hargrove was really behind all this, he could make his move at any moment. Richard needed to protect those children, and to do that he would have to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it was. That night, as he walked through the mansion's hallways, Richard felt as if a dark shadow was following him. Memories of his competition with Hargrove haunted him, mingling with images of Tommy and the baby. He had been ruthless, relentless in his pursuit of success, but now those actions from the past had come back to torment him. He stopped in front of the door to the room where the children were sleeping. He opened the door carefully and saw Tommy awake, curled up next to the baby, who was sleeping peacefully. The soft light of a lamp illuminated the room, and Richard felt a pang of pain as he saw the expression on Tommy's face, a mixture of sadness and determination that shouldn't belong to a child so young. "Tommy," he said quietly, entering the room, "I know you're scared. I'm scared too, but I want you to know that I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Do you trust me?" Tommy looked up at Richard, and for a moment it seemed like he was going to say something, but he stopped. Instead, he nodded slowly without saying a word. Richard approached and sat on the bed, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know you're carrying a heavy burden and it's not fair," Richard continued, his voice laden with emotion. "But you don't have to carry it alone. I'm here to help you, to protect you. Whatever you're holding inside, you don't have to face it by yourself." Tommy looked at him, and for the first time, Richard saw a flicker of something beyond distrust in his eyes. Perhaps it was hope, or maybe just the recognition that he wasn't alone anymore. Either way, Richard felt that he had taken a small step toward gaining the trust he so desperately wanted. That night, Richard left the door to the room slightly ajar as he left, as a sign that he was there for the children, ready for whatever might come. He knew that the battle against the ghosts of his past had just begun, and that he would need all the strength and determination to protect the children from the shadows looming over them. In the depths of the night, as the mansion sank into silence, Richard realized that for the first time in his life, he had something more to protect than his wealth. He had those children, and with them, a chance at redemption that he couldn't afford to lose. The days continued to be filled with tension at the Marlowe mansion. Richard tried to maintain his composure as the detective's investigation intensified, but inside the pressure was mounting. He knew that time was running out and that the threat of Victor Hargrove loomed over them like a sinister shadow. However, what Richard didn't suspect was that the danger was much closer than he imagined. One afternoon, while Richard was working in his study, he received an unexpected call from Detective Sarah Carter. Her voice, usually calm, had a note of urgency that put Richard on alert. "Mr. Marlowe, I need to speak with you. It's important," Sarah said without preamble. Richard felt something dark stirring in his stomach. "I'm in my study. You can come by whenever you want." It wasn't long before Sarah arrived at the mansion. Her expression was grave, and Richard immediately knew that things had taken an unexpected turn. He invited her to sit, but she remained standing, as if the situation was too urgent to allow for comfort. "We've found something," Sarah began, looking Richard directly in the eyes. "Something I didn't expect, but it explains a lot." Richard remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "During our investigation, we've been monitoring the movements of everyone in the mansion, not just yours," she explained. "A couple of days ago, we noticed that Mrs. Thompson, your housekeeper, has been acting suspiciously. This morning we found conclusive evidence that leads us to believe she has been in contact with Victor Hargrove for some time." Sarah's words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. Mrs. Thompson, the woman he had trusted for years, was betraying him. It felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "What kind of evidence?" he managed to ask, his voice tense. Sarah pulled out a small recording device and placed it on the desk. "We intercepted a phone call between Mrs. Thompson and someone we believe is Hargrove. The conversation reveals that she has been providing information about you and the children. Hargrove manipulated her using an old debt she had, threatening her with consequences if she didn't cooperate." Richard felt a mix of anger and betrayal that took his breath away. He had trusted Mrs. Thompson, had considered her almost like part of the family, and now he discovered that she had been working against him from the beginning. "I can't believe this," he murmured, his mind spinning with the new information. "She betrayed me. All this time." Sarah nodded seriously. "We don't know the full extent of her involvement, but it's clear that her loyalty was bought by Hargrove. We need to confront her, but I wanted you to know before we proceed." Richard stood up, trying to control the anger boiling inside him. "Take me to her. I want to hear from her own mouth why she did this." Sarah led him to the servants' wing of the mansion, where Mrs. Thompson was in her room. When they arrived, they found her hurriedly packing a suitcase, as if she were ready to flee. When she saw Richard and Sarah at the door, Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted from surprise to fear. "Mr. Marlowe, she began to say, but the words caught in her throat. "Why?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "Why did you betray me after all these years? How could you do this, especially to the children?" Mrs. Thompson lowered her head, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I had no choice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Hargrove, he knew things about me, things that could ruin me. He threatened me, forced me to do it. I never wanted to hurt you, sir. I never wanted it to go this far." Richard felt his rage mix with a deep sadness. Although he understood that Hargrove had manipulated her, the betrayal was still painful. "What made you think that betraying me, betraying these children, was the only option?" he asked, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what she had done. "I was afraid," she responded, lifting her gaze to meet Richard's eyes. "But when I saw those children, I knew what I was doing was wrong. I tried to warn you, tried to find a way to stop it, but it was already too late. Last night, when I disabled the cameras and left the window open, I did it knowing I was making a terrible mistake. Please, forgive me." Richard felt a pang in his chest. Mrs. Thompson, despite her actions, seemed genuinely remorseful. But the damage was done and the children were in danger because of her. "Forgiving you won't change what you did," Richard said coldly. "Hargrove is using those children to get to me, and you gave him the tools to do it." Sarah, who had remained silent until then, stepped in. "Mr. Marlowe, we need to know where the children are now. Mrs. Thompson might have information that can help us find them before it's too late." Mrs. Thompson nodded weakly, knowing that her only redemption would be helping to save the children. "I know where he took them," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a property, an old house that belonged to the Hargrove family. He has them there." Sarah turned to Richard, who nodded with determination. There was no time to lose. With the knowledge of the location, they could organize a raid to rescue the children before Hargrove could carry out his final act of revenge. Before leaving the room, Richard looked at Mrs. Thompson one last time. "You stay here until the police come to get you," he said harshly. "You'll regret what you've done, but that doesn't change the fact that you've betrayed my trust in the worst possible way." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her tears falling silently as Richard and Sarah left the room. Armed with the information, Sarah quickly communicated with Detective Harris and the local police units. An operation was organized within minutes, and soon the Marlowe mansion became a hub of activity. Despite Sarah's recommendation to stay behind, Richard insisted on going with them. He couldn't stand by while the children he had come to consider his own were in danger. The drive to the old Hargrove property was tense. Richard could barely contain his anger and fear. He had been manipulated, betrayed by someone he trusted. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant compared to the need to save the children. He felt an overwhelming responsibility for them and was determined to do whatever it took to protect them. When they arrived at the property, the scene was unsettling. The house, once elegant, now lay in ruins, surrounded by tall, dark trees. It seemed like the perfect setting for the final act of Hargrove's revenge. Richard, Sarah, and Harris, along with the other officers, approached cautiously, knowing that any misstep could be fatal. The tension in the air was palpable. Richard felt his heart pounding as they neared the entrance. He knew they were about to face a desperate and dangerous man, but there was no turning back. The children were inside, and he would not allow anything to happen to them. As the officers surrounded the house and prepared to enter, Richard looked at Sarah. There was a silent understanding between them. What was at stake went beyond any personal vendetta, beyond any redemption. It was a matter of life and death, and they both knew what had to be done. With one last glance at the entrance of the house, Richard took a deep breath, preparing for what was to come. He knew this confrontation would be the most difficult of his life, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Sarah, Harris, and the others by his side, he was ready to face the ghosts of his past and save the children from the darkness that threatened to consume them. At that moment, Richard realized that this was his chance to redeem himself, to do the right thing, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in his way. The atmosphere around the old Hargrove property was thick with tension, as if the air itself anticipated the impending confrontation. The house, once a symbol of power and wealth, now stood in ruins, reflecting the state of its owner, Victor Hargrove, a man consumed by vengeance. Richard Marlowe, accompanied by Detectives Sarah Carter and John Harris, moved forward with calculated steps, knowing that any wrong move could cost them dearly. The police team had surrounded the property, preparing to enter from multiple angles. Despite warnings from Sarah and Harris, Richard insisted on leading the group, heading directly to the main entrance. He couldn't stay behind while the children, whom he now considered his responsibility, were in danger. He felt that the fate of his life was being played out in these moments. As they approached the house, the silence grew deeper, broken only by the crunch of branches underfoot and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Richard could feel the adrenaline beginning to take over his body, sharpening his senses and preparing him for what was to come. "Remember, we must proceed with caution," Harris whispered, motioning for the officers to take their positions. "Hargrove is a dangerous man, and we don't know how desperate he might be." Richard nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on the front door. He knew time wasn't on their side. Every passing second increased the risk to the children, and the thought of something happening to them tormented him. Finally, Harris gave the signal, and the team moved toward the entrance. Richard, alongside Sarah, forced the door, which gave way with a sinister creak. Inside, the house was dark and gloomy, the furniture covered in dust and the windows sealed, letting in only a faint ray of light. Everything in that place spoke of abandonment and despair, reflecting the soul of its owner. As they moved through the main hallway, Richard heard a noise coming from one of the side rooms. He signaled to Sarah, and together they headed toward the source of the sound, remaining alert to any movement. When they opened the door, they found an almost empty room, except for an old broken-down crib in the corner. Richard's heart stopped for a moment, fearing the worst, but the crib was empty. "The children must be in another part of the house," Sarah murmured, her face tense with worry. They continued moving forward, searching each room with growing desperation. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hallway, from which a faint glow emanated. Richard felt a knot in his stomach, knowing that behind that door lay the confrontation he had been dreading and anticipating. Without waiting any longer, Harris gave the signal and the door was forced open. Inside the room, under the dim light of a lamp, sat Victor Hargrove, in a chair beside a table. Next to him on the floor were Tommy and the baby, tied up with fear in their eyes. Hargrove's face was marked by years of resentment and hatred, but also by a kind of sinister calm that could only come from someone who no longer feared the consequences of his actions. "Hargrove!" Richard shouted, moving toward him, but stopped when he saw Hargrove raise a hand, pointing a gun in the direction of the children. "Don't take another step, Marlowe," Hargrove said, his voice cold as ice. "You've finally come to face the consequences of your actions." Richard felt a mixture of rage and fear consuming him, but he knew he had to stay calm. Any wrong move could endanger the children. "You don't have to do this, Hargrove. What happened in the past, I regret it, but it's not these children you should punish." Hargrove let out a bitter laugh, as if Richard's words were a cruel joke. You regret what you did. You regret destroying my life, taking away everything I loved? No, Marlowe, you have no idea the pain you caused, and now I'm going to give it back to you tenfold. Sarah, moving slowly, began to edge closer from the side, looking for an opportunity to disarm Hargrove without him noticing. However, Hargrove was alert, and his gaze fixed on her. Don't even think about it, Detective, Hargrove warned, pointing the gun at Sarah. Everyone will pay for what they did to me, and I'm going to start with what you love most. At that moment, Tommy, who had been silent the entire time, decided to act. With surprising bravery for a child his age, he lunged at Hargrove's arm, trying to knock the gun away. The surprise on Hargrove's face gave Sarah and Harris the opportunity they needed. In one swift move, Sarah tackled Hargrove, disarming him as Harris immobilized him. The gun clattered to the floor with a loud crash, and within seconds, Hargrove was handcuffed and placed under custody. Without wasting a moment, Richard rushed to Tommy and the baby, kneeling beside them. His heart was pounding as he untied the ropes that held them. "Tommy, you're safe," Richard murmured, hugging the boy tightly. "You're safe, it's all over." Tommy, still trembling from the adrenaline, clung to Richard, and for the first time since Richard had met him, the boy broke down in tears. They were tears of relief, fear, and all the weight he had carried on his small shoulders. Richard held them, feeling the accumulated tension beginning to dissipate. The baby, though frightened, was also safe in his arms. Richard felt a surge of relief and gratitude, knowing that despite everything that had happened, the children were okay. Hargrove, meanwhile, was escorted out of the room by Harris. His face was marked by bitter defeat, but also by a strange sense of relief, as if, in the end, he had found some twisted peace in his capture. When the police secured the property and took Hargrove away, Richard remained in the room with Tommy and the baby, unable to take his eyes off them. Sarah approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did it," she said quietly. "They're safe, thanks to you." Richard nodded, unable to find the right words to respond. He had gone through so many emotions in such a short time that he felt overwhelmed. But in that moment, as he held the children in his arms, he knew it had all been worth it. He had faced his past, saved the children, and in the process found a purpose he never imagined he would have. As they left the house, Richard looked up at the sky, seeing the first light of dawn begin to break on the horizon. The darkness was finally fading, not just in the night, but in his life as well. And with the children by his side, he knew that although the road ahead would be difficult, he was ready to face it. Together, as a family. The sun slowly rose over the Marlowe mansion, illuminating every corner with a warmth that seemed to reflect the new beginning Richard felt inside. The days of chaos and tension were behind them, and with Victor Hargrove's capture, a dark shadow had lifted from his life. However, Richard knew that the true battle was only just beginning, the battle to build a new and meaningful life for Tommy, the baby, and for himself. After the rescue, Richard spent long hours in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of his success and solitude, now felt different. There was laughter in the hallways, a gentle hum of life that hadn't existed before. Tommy and the baby, whom he now called Lucas, were beginning to adjust, and Richard found himself surprised by the deep affection he had developed for them. That morning, as they had breakfast together in the large kitchen, Richard watched the children with a sense of wonder. Tommy, though still bearing the emotional scars of his short but difficult life, had begun to open up. His eyes were no longer filled with fear, but with a budding curiosity. Lucas, babbling happily, played with a spoon, filling the space with his laughter. Richard smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he had never experienced before. He had spent so much time focused on his business, on accumulating wealth, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. Now these children had taught him something no financial transaction could offer, the true value of human connection, of family. "Today is a special day," Richard said, addressing Tommy, who looked up from his plate with curiosity. "I want to talk to you both about the future." Tommy nodded, listening intently. Despite his young age, the boy was perceptive and understood more than Richard could have imagined. I've made a decision, Richard continued, his voice gentle but firm. I want both of you to stay with me. Not as guests, but as part of my family. I want to adopt you, to be your father, if you agree. Tommy stared at him for a moment, processing what Richard had just said. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from fear or sadness, but from relief and hope. Without saying a word, Tommy stood up from his chair and ran to Richard, throwing himself into his arms. Richard hugged him tightly, feeling that this small gesture spoke more than 1,000 words. Does this mean Lucas and I are going to stay here forever? Tommy asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Yes, Tommy, Richard replied with a lump in his throat. It means this is your home now, and it always will be. We are a family. Lucas, who didn't fully understand what was happening but sensed the emotion in the air, began to laugh, and his laughter spread to Richard and Tommy, who joined him in a shared laughter that filled the kitchen with a joy Richard had never known before. Later that day, Richard met with Sarah in his study. She had been a constant and reassuring presence over the past few days, and her support had been crucial in overcoming the challenges they faced. He knew that without her, he wouldn't have made it this far. Sarah, Richard began with a mix of gratitude and sincerity in his voice, I want to thank you for everything you've done. Without you, I don't know how I would have managed to face all of this. You didn't just help me save these children, you also showed me that there's more to life than work and money. Sarah smiled, her gaze soft and understanding. Richard, it's been a difficult journey, but I'm happy to have been able to help. These children, they've found someone to trust in you, and that's the most important thing. Richard nodded, knowing that what they had shared during this time was special, but also knowing that his path now needed to focus on Tommy and Lucas. Sarah, I want you to know that you'll always be a close friend to us. You've been a light in a dark moment, and we'll always be grateful to you. Sarah, understanding the meaning of his words, nodded with a warm smile. I know, Richard. I'm sure you'll be a great father to them, and though our paths may be different, I'll always be here if you need me. With a hug that sealed their friendship, Sarah said her goodbyes, leaving Richard, Tommy, and Lucas to begin their new life together. The days that followed were filled with changes, but this time they were welcome changes. Richard began the legal process to adopt Tommy and Lucas. It was a long and complicated process, but with each document signed, he felt he was one step closer to solidifying the family he had found. The Marlowe mansion, once cold and empty, transformed into a vibrant and lively home. The rooms that had been vacant were now filled with toys, laughter, and memories in the making. The rigid and opulent structure of the house softened with the warmth of the new life it housed. Finally, the day when the adoption papers were approved arrived. Richard and the children went to the courthouse for the official ceremony, and although it was a simple event, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. When the judge signed the final documents, Richard felt a surge of emotion. He was no longer just a lonely millionaire. He was now a father, a protector, someone who had found his true purpose in life. Upon returning to the mansion, the family celebrated with a simple but meaningful dinner. As they sat at the table, Richard couldn't help but smile as he watched his children laughing together, enjoying the meal and each other's company. Tommy and Lucas were his family, and that gave him a peace and satisfaction he had never known before. That night, after putting the children to bed, Richard sat in the living room, gazing at the stars through the large windows. He reflected on everything that had happened, from the cold night when he found Tommy and Lucas on the street, to the moment he decided to adopt them and give them a home. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were challenges to face, wounds to heal, but he was ready to face it all with them. The trust and love they had begun to build together were the solid foundation on which their new life would rise. As he prepared to retire for the night, Richard took one last look around the mansion. He no longer saw a monument to his success, but a home filled with promises. He smiled, knowing he had found something far more valuable than anything money could buy. Alongside Tommy and Lucas, Richard embarked on a new chapter of his life, one filled with hope, love, and the certainty that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together, as a family. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay updated on more stories filled with emotion and drama. See you in the next chapter, where we'll continue exploring lives, emotions, and the magic of storytelling. Until next time.